in your power and by your image, to be instructed with what you are calling us to do. Help us, Lord, to hear your voice. Do this, whether through me or in spite of me. For this we pray. Amen. We enter now into I believe the 6th week of our exploration of the Apostles' Creed. We last week talked about the resurrection of Christ and how on the 3rd day he rose from the dead. We discussed about how important, how pivotal that is to our faith. This week we move on to the next line that he ascended into heaven. And we're breaking this part out just to take and acknowledge that the 40 days after Christ's resurrection, when he was there on the earth, he was appearing to the disciples in many different forms. And he came to each of them in the ways that they needed in order to be able to understand him. During this 40-day period before the ascension, we hear the stories of doubting Thomas, the disciple who wasn't there the first time that Jesus appeared, and so that he told all of the other disciples that he will not believe that Christ is risen until he can place his fingers in the holes of his wrist and in his side. And then it turns out the next time that the disciples all gather together, Christ appears among them and steps forward and tells Thomas to place his fingers there and to touch his side. We hear about the story of the disciples who are on the road to Damascus and how they're talking about the scriptures and trying to understand them and figure them out when this stranger comes up behind them and asks them to tell him about them, and he begins explaining the scriptures to them. And when they finally get to where they're going for the night, he sits down with them and he breaks bread with them. And in the breaking of the bread, they finally recognize that it's Jesus. And then, even in the darkness, they run all the way back to tell the other disciples, claiming how their hearts were on fire the entire time he was talking to them on the road. He appears to the fishermen as they're out in the boats. And he walks along the beach and reminds them of their call story, of how he came to know them in the beginning. And as they're out there in the boats, he tells them yet once again to cast their net into the water, even though they hadn't been catching anything. And just like when they were first called, they listened to him, and lo and behold, their net is full of fish, and they bring it ashore, and they have breakfast together, and they get to be there with Jesus and that again. All of this kind of culminates to the moment at the end, to the ascension. And we can look at Matthew 28 and find the story there. We have the story here at the end of Luke. We also can look in the very beginning of Acts, and we can see all of the story there and how these appearances matter. And then it gets to this point, that the disciples are all there to worship Jesus, and they're talking with him there outside of Bethany, and he gives them his final words and thoughts. He tells them in Matthew that all authority on heaven and earth has been given unto me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And lo, I will be with you even unto the end of this age. And with these final parting words, Jesus ascends up into heaven. Now, this part of the creed is probably not as pivotal as the resurrection, and it's certainly not as a major part of our faith as some of the other things that we state, and yet there's still something that the early church found that was important about this. That there's something about the ascension that reminded them of all the stories and the appearances, but there's also this level of importance that goes with it, because in the ascension, there are a couple things that happen. First, Jesus rises into heaven like Elijah, and that kind of helps to once again reaffirm his divinity to all the disciples. And actually, his ascension into heaven is also a precursor to what we'll look at next week, which is that he now sitteth at the right hand of God the Father Almighty to judge the quick and the dead. So his ascension has the spiritual application of physically moving from the earth into taking his place in the heavens. But there's also the practical application. That you see, if Jesus had continued to remain on earth, it wouldn't be long, in theory, before other people might have started seeing him. And people like the Pharisees, the people who would put him to death, imagine what might have happened if they had had one of these encounters with the risen Christ. It's kind of hard to deny him as God if the person that you put to death is suddenly resurrected and able to perform all these miracles again. And the problem is that they probably would have started following Jesus not for the right reasons. That they may have started worshiping him as God, but they would probably not have had the transformative life experience. They would not have necessarily listened and taken his teachings to heart. Instead, they would probably try to place him on a pedestal and to separate him from all the common rabble and stuff, just as they had separated themselves. And they would have most likely essentially just continued to do things the same way they'd always done. They would have tried to convince him that their hearts were the pure and true hearts, and that everyone else that was a sinner should probably be pushed away. And so there's this practicality that Jesus needed to physically, he needed to leave. He needed to go somewhere, but he still needed to keep his body. So that even in the life here to come, we have this physical presence of Jesus, this manifestation of God that we can know and we can relate to. That part of Jesus' incarnation was so that we could see him and that we could talk with him and experience him. And so by ascending into heaven rather than just letting his body die and becoming a spiritual being again, we continue to have that relationship and that connectability with God. And it's actually not the first time that we hear that someone ascended into heaven. We actually have the prophet Elijah, who was often confused for Jesus, who was also said to have ascended into heaven. Now he had a lovely fanfare. He actually got to ascend into heaven in a beautiful chariot of fire and so on and so forth. But he still doesn't ever die, and his body is still never left on earth. It is taken up with him. And Elijah is supposed to be Jesus' predecessor, the one who prepares the way for him. Elijah is another way to also say John. And so like John the Baptist, you have Elijah, and you kind of get this whole complete picture. But we note that here in the Ascension, Jesus and Elijah are very much alike. And it speaks to their holiness. That there's something about them that can't just be left to decay, but that must be preserved. And so all of these things kind of fit into this one little line of he ascended into heaven. And unfortunately, the way that we often end up saying it, I know it seems confusing because often we say, and on the third day he rose from the dead, he ascended into heaven. A lot of people think that means that he ascended into heaven on the third day, and we really don't do very well with that comma that's actually separating the two phrases. But as part of the creed, it is important to note that this line actually does have a whole lot of meaning behind it and has a whole lot more story than just a simple phrase of Christ rising up and taking his spot. There's all of this baggage around it. And so what does this mean for us? Well, as Jesus was about to ascend into heaven, he gave that commission. He told the disciples to go, therefore, and make disciples of all the nations. In his final words here on earth, Jesus passes the torch off to the disciples. He tells them basically, all that I've done, all that you have seen me do, I'm now leaving for you to do. And I want you to do this. He even specifically, prior to this moment, tells Peter, if you love me, feed my sheep. And Peter says, I love you. And he says, if you love me, feed my sheep. And it's this sense that as a people, as followers of God, Christ's last command here on earth, the last part of his ministry, was to say to us, here's the torch. Now you guys go and make disciples of all the nations. And we, as we come to a close in our lives, we are also meant to pass that torch off to the next group of people. It's a pattern that Jesus shows us for right before we leave our earthly ministries, that we are meant to pass off the torch and to continue making disciples of all the nations. And so as you go from this place today, I want you to think about the fact that Christ ascended into heaven, and to remember that as he ascends into heaven, he is still leaving us with a ministry to do. That we are to spread the good news, that we are to live in ways that help other people come to know him. Not just the ways that are popular and the ways that make us a lot of friends or taking care of our friends, but in ways that show a courageous generosity and a courageous love for persons, even persons we may not like. If only to open a door to a conversation about how much Jesus means to us and how his commandment to us and his ministry that he left us with is important enough for us to overcome all of these fears and dislikes and things that keep us from doing this on a regular basis. It is my hope and my prayer that as a church we can stand there and worship God as he ascends, and to show that and live out that worship through our actions of love in this world. Amen.